Hi, and welcome to the Leader's Edge, how to sharpen your competitive advantage and make a positive impact as a leader in your organization and community. I'm Emily Chiwa, and with me is Georgia Donaldson as usual. Hi, Georgia. We are
Hi,
leadership
hi
coaches.
everyone.
Hello. We are leadership coaches and hosts of this show. And today we are speaking with Francis Tweed on leadership and strategy. Francis, you correct me if I'm wrong anywhere here, but Francis is the president of Framework Consulting Inc. He's a with Jamaica. He's a Jump Leap Long Term Strategy podcast. Am I right, Francis?
Correct.
Got it? And your LinkedIn bio also
Yes.
says consultant who solves tough strategy and productivity problems. So I'm loving that quote there, Francis. So I think no doubt we'd have all ears on Francis for this topic on leadership and strategy. And as we start with the awareness piece, Georgia, I often have leaders tell me that they need to learn to be more strategic, right? They're getting involved in fighting too many fires and they need to learn how to step back so that they can do a better job at leading. So I don't know,
Yeah.
Georgia, if you want to start off with something to ask Francis and then we'll continue on from there.
Okay, thanks, Emily. I'm happy you mentioned that because I've heard leaders say that very often as well. And I've also heard them say to people at lower level, you need to be more strategic. So the word strategy comes up in so many different ways and forms. And Francis, I'm sure you've heard that time and time again. So I'd love for you to jump in, Francis, and tell us your journey through this whole strategy thing with leaders. What are some of the things you've heard them say over time that makes you go, oh, really?
They don't know how to be strategic. Just like you said, they have a struggle. They want to do great things. So they have in their mind that they're in a leadership position to make some magic happen, but they don't have the means to make it happen. And they think it has something to do with strategy, but they're not sure. And they come to us and complain, we kind of want to head somewhere different, but we don't know where we want to go and we don't know what process to follow. Because most CEOs have risen through the ranks. They know how to do short term problem solving as a middle manager or as a director. Then they get promoted all of a sudden to the top job or to the C suite. And now they need to think differently. And the board starts to look to them and say, listen, we need a strategy from you guys. You can't just come and just fix problems and tell us about the short term every day. And frankly, the C-suiters, they struggle because this is not something that you learn from an
Mm-hmm.
MBA program. It's not something you learn by picking up a book. It's not something you learn from, just hanging around the typical managers who populate the typical company. Even you can hang around the C-suite, and most C-suite conversations, a Monday morning meeting, are about the problems that happened in the last week and how to solve them this week. So most C-suites
Right.
don't engage in strategy conversations. So it's a real problem, and it's not a skill that comes as a function of finishing a degree or, like I said, reading a book.
Okay, okay. So, Francis, I'm glad you mentioned something about short term and on long term because there's this raging debate. Should strategy really be short term, 3 years to 5 years, or much longer?
Well, the quick answer for us is there's no such thing as a short-term strategy. That's a misnomer. It's two opposites put together in the same sentence. What we say instead is that you can have short-term tactics, but a strategy for our purposes is anywhere from 10 to 30 years old. And frankly, we weren't always in this business, of long-term strategy. It was actually prompted by a conversation I had with someone who you both know, but I'll tell you what the conversation was. We used to lead transformation
Okay.
program in companies. We did it in the 90s and the early 2000s. And then we noticed that our clients were having a tough time inspiring their staff to do the right thing, even though they were inspired. So they were transformed. They could see a whole brand new future. They were excited, but they didn't know what to do next. So our clients started to say to us that we don't know what to give them to do because they're asking us for, okay, how do we help? We're ready. we're engaged. What do we do? And the senior management would kind of look at them and go, I don't know, because they didn't have a strategy. So it got us into the world of strategy and strategic planning. And the very first retreat actually took place with Donna Duncan. And I can mention her name because she has gone on public to share what happened way back in 2002. And
Ah,
sat down with her for a couple of days, brought in a couple other a board member and her brother, who's our not currently the managing director, and we created a 25-year strategy. And that was the
wow,
first time
25 years, Francis.
that was the first time I had ever done that kind of work. And it's a good thing I was doing it with somebody who was already open to the idea and someone who was friendly. So this is a long time
Yes,
ago.
yes.
But if you look at the results that JMB has accomplished and the things that came out in that retreat, which was actually in her living room at the time, you'd see that it followed from the commitments that they made, because they said some things there that today you would say, oh, yeah, of course. But back then, when they were saying that, they were absolutely revolutionary for the company. So the difference that we were able to make, all of us who participated, were able to look into the future and say, what do we want for this company 2.5 decades from now? And that's not a question that managers or even C-suiters regularly ask. But
Yeah,
once you ask it and you do it in a rigorous way, you can come up with answers that are absolutely game changing, like it was for JMB.
right. So that
That's
was
right.
revolutionary. Can you think of that, Emily? Do you know of any other company, Emily, that goes beyond 5 years, much more 25 years?
Not that I can recall. So I'm now thinking of what Francis is saying, and I mean, I've never really heard of anybody doing 25 years. Francis, that is
Yes.
phenomenal. And I mean, I feel like it takes a certain, I don't know, as you said, a whole different mindset to be able to try to envision, especially at the rate of change of the world, especially with technology now, and all the things, people feel very uncertain to look beyond, I think,
Yes.
5 years. So I think that's probably where the 5 years has come about. So it's interesting that you said, I mean, I was very curious from the time you said 10 to 30 years. I'm like, 10 to 30 years. Okay.
Yes.
So, I mean, if the leaders looking on, right? And I mean, as you said, like some people, depending on their level or depending on where they fall in the organization, but especially I suppose if you're in the C-suite and up, and you're looking on and you're thinking, how do I make an impact on the company that I'm working in a meaningful impact? And how can we become more strategic? I'm curious as to what you would say, to start, because you said we can't learn it, so
Yes.
we haven't been learning it in the MBA. So I'm curious as to what would you say to encourage persons to start to change or switch on this mindset to allow them to actually start to embrace this way. I'm assuming it's a way of thinking or looking at things. So tell me, Francis, tell us.
From our point of view, it's not rocket science in the sense that we have a magic, we do some magic. So we've done over 50 retreats that go from 15 to 30 years over the last 2 decades. But we basically lock people in a room and say, we're not leaving until we have a
Against their will?
25-year, 20-year. And we do ask them a set of questions, but they don't have to be particularly gifted or even have a mindset that is revolutionary or even be inspirational or particularly visionary, as long as they're willing to answer a series of questions as a
Wow.
team. Now, if you go to the average adult is going to have a hard time looking around, 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years. The average individual has a hard time seeing that far out. But
Right.
the average team, however, especially if it's a team that runs a company, they don't have a difficulty because there's enough people in there who have been thinking this way separately, even though they haven't been thinking that way together. They've
Right.
been
That's a good
exposed to
point.
board members, they've been on boards, so they have the idea that the long term is important, but they just have never gone through an exercise to do it. So most, from our experience, welcome the exercise, and once we start asking the questions, they're able to answer them. So they're able to do well. They do far better than they think they would at at the very beginning, when it seems like, oh my goodness, I don't know how I'm gonna cope. But the truth is,
Mhm.
you ask a 10-year-old who wants to be a doctor, they're
Mhm.
making a 25-year commitment. Now they might not know that at the outset, but at some point it dawns on them by the time they get to 15, let's say, before they do their CXE, CSEC, CAPE, O levels, whatever, before they do their exams, it dawns on them that this is a long journey, and the long journey is going to take a certain long-term commitment. And they
Right.
have no problem making that commitment at that age. Most of us, of course, don't become doctors. I don't think any of us actually are. So
Mhm.
we don't tend to have that pathway laid out as clearly and crisply as it is for someone in medicine. But the thinking is certainly familiar to us, that when you commit to something big, it requires a long-term kind of commitment in order to realize it. And that's just the way the world works.
Mhm.
Right.
I
Okay.
like
That
that.
is an important point. And I like the
Yeah.
analogy. Yes. Yes, Emily.
I was gonna say I like that you spoke, the example of the 10-year-old making that commitment, because then commitment is important to execution, because it dawned on me, okay, yes, we can sit in the room and come up with the plans, of
Yes.
course, and then how do we make that execution and make that a reality, and then
Mhm.
carry it forward, like really keep that alive. Um, and and I guess we talk agile a lot in our that's part of our dictionary now in terms of how we expected to cope with change and so on. So I'm also curious as we execute on the commitment to the long-term plan and things pop up along the way. I'm
Mhm.
curious as to what would you recommend for people again to remain in that strategic alignment with the future and have that go forward to the 20 years or the 25 years.
Good
What would you
question.
say?
I'm going to use the medical analogy again, because we all know
Yeah.
friends who became doctors, right? They
Mhm.
didn't. It's not something you fall into by accident. It's not something you decide to do when you're 25. Usually,
I beg to differ.
Mhm.
somebody.
I have a friend who decided to do it after we finished our first degree. So go ahead.
Oh, okay. So like a 20, that's like the exception, right? Most of them decide to do it sometime
Good.
earlier than that, because they have to make choices around subjects and exams in order to be able to get the CAPE results that allow them to get into university, that allow them to make the progress they need to make.
Yeah.
So they have an idea of the steps that they need to take. But if in third form they fail their first biology test, now what? No, some people will give up. It's true. Other people will double their determination. And the question is around agile. You don't change from saying, "Oh, I failed biology. I'm going to become a judge instead because I'm obviously not cut out for medicine." And if you talk to people who are doctors, they all had some stumbling block along the way, whether it was not passing an exam, not having the dollars or the money that they needed to fund their education, not having the support of a family member or a friend or somebody who told them that you don't have what it takes. Some teacher could tell them you're not good enough to become a doctor. Try something else instead. But they've all had these moments. So agile for me is about making immediate decisions against the context of a long-term game-changing commitment. So you need both. Agile doesn't
Mhm.
mean running around like a chicken with your head cut off, chasing after one
Okay.
goal after another. But that's unfortunately what happens in many companies, which take the chicken analogy too far and
Right.
end up going after one short-term goal after another. And what
Yeah.
happens when companies do that is they end up like Kodak.
Ah.
Remember, Emily, you too young, but back in my day, right?
What about
We
me,
used to buy this
Francis?
thing called film.
He didn't
And
say
this,
I'm too young.
well, I know you. I know you're a little bit.
He knows you longer. He knows you longer. It was
But we used to buy this thing called film from the
Yeah.
pharmacy. And we used to
Yeah.
put it in a camera. And if you explain that to somebody young, they're like, "What?" And we
Yep.
used to you would tell them that the big company back then was a company called Kodak,
Mm-hmm.
and all you get are blank looks. So
Yeah.
Kodak is no longer in business because they didn't have a long-term perspective about where their industry was going. They kept making short-term adjustments until they went right out of business. Their
Yep.
big competitor at the time, Fuji, is in business, but they're not selling film. They saw what was coming and made a long-term, very painful transition to become a company that developed, I think it's some chemical processing.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't do film anymore. They
Oh,
changed. It was very hard for them to change, but they saw that what was coming. So they
Right.
survived and are thriving, and Kodak no longer exists.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes to the power of making a long-term commitment and not being like a chicken with their head cut off, even though there's a pandemic and even though there's a
Mm-hmm.
war and even though there's a this and there's a that. And we talk to companies, we see that they are on a spectrum of being able to commit to the long term and being like chickens with their heads cut off on the other end. And on the other end, where you're being purely reactive, you're basically planting the seeds of your own destruction.
Right. Okay. So, Francis, you've been in dozens, scores of strategic planning sessions. Is there anyone that stands out, a story that you want to share with us that maybe others could be wary of, or an inspiration for others?
I like the Jimmy B example,
Yes.
because I saw it happen in real time.
Okay.
Another one that I know of, you're asking for examples, was Grace Kennedy. So
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't there for this one because I wasn't in the field at the time. But I've interviewed Douglas Orain a few times. And back in 1995, uh, GK didn't have any kind of long-term commitment or perspective. And they invented GK 2020, which was another 25-year strategy.
mm,
Wow.
And what it meant was coming out of they used to have like a travel agency and all kinds of other businesses, coming
Mm-hmm.
out of those businesses and focusing on two areas: food, which they've always focused on, and
Right.
financial services, which they had kind of sort of dabbled in but weren't serious about. Now, financial services today makes more money than food. And the rationale for why they did it was that they needed foreign exchange. Jamaica was going through a foreign exchange crisis similar to the one that Trinidad is going through now.
mhm.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, without foreign exchange, we're not going to last. So they invested in a financial services arm so that they would have foreign exchange, so that in 25 years, they wouldn't have the pressure of having to find foreign exchange. And the strategy worked. The competitors that they had back in 1995 have pretty much gone out of business. We don't even
Mm-hmm.
know their names anymore. And
Right.
they
Yeah.
are thriving. So I wasn't there for that one. It's not a personal example, but
Okay.
they are a shining example for the region.
Yes.
Right. So we've seen two giants, two conglomerates who took that 20-year leap and look at what they're doing now. That's wonderful. Emily, as we start to come to a wrap, what are some of the things that you think our listeners we want them to think about doing over the next week, 2 weeks? So we're giving them short-term goals right now
Well,
when
I
they think
think,
about strategy.
yeah, so I think one of the key takeaways, and I guess the question to the audience really is, what have you taken away from what Francis has said?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I think that is critical is to recognize that one, you need to think about putting aside time to
Yes.
look at what we call strategy, look at what we have, what you have in your companies, and determine, is this really strategy? And if it isn't, then maybe start thinking of some of the ideas that Francis would have shared and some of the stories that he would have shared with us in terms of how can we now
Mm-hmm.
change this? Do we want to change it, first of all? And if we do, how can we change this and start taking the actions towards
Mm-hmm.
that? That would be what I would say to people listening who
Right.
this hits home for. And Francis, you wanted to
Yeah.
share. I mean, I know you help people struggle with this. So how about if you explain like how people can connect with you, if this is something they feel they want to reach out on further and stuff like that, maybe? What would you say?
Sure. Sure. One of the capabilities that we're focusing on between now and we have a conference coming up in June is how do you engage boards in long-term strategy? In many companies, boards are for whatever reason, boards are sidelined, they're not included in strategy. So executives also need to learn how to tap into the power of their board because chances are there's somebody who joined the board thinking that they were going to be doing long-term stuff and they're not doing it perhaps and they don't know why, but they're waiting to be asked in the right way to join in the fun. It's just that nobody has asked them yet. So to find out more information about our conference and our newsletter, and we also do a podcast, it's www.longtermstrategy.info. And there you can subscribe and find out all the kinds of different things that we're doing in this area here in the Caribbean, but also we're really doing it for an international audience, a global audience.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Yes. And Emily, as leadership coaches, both of us, from time to time, we have our clients who we are talking to, and they talk to us about the challenges and the difficulties they have in getting their team to think long term. So it's so important for coaches, when you're speaking with your leadership clients, to get them themselves to start thinking long term and to involve people and make sure that they're part of the process. So thank you, Francis. I'm happy you mentioned, getting the board on, and it's also important for the other employees to be part of that process as well. So this was a wonderful conversation. Yes.
Absolutely.
Thanks. And Emily, over to you to wrap.
So thanks again. It's been great, Francis. Appreciate the time. Wishing you well with your conference. I'm hoping that some of the people listening will sign up and join. This is such an important topic because regionally we have so many things, so many places and spaces to grow into. And if we're not thinking strategically and starting to make those plans, we will not get there. We don't want to be like Kodak, right? So let's not be like Kodak.
I like that.
Thank you again, and all the best.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.